Paul, you keep trying to you put yourself on the queue. I recognize you, and then you drop out. I don't know. Welcome. Just going to get into the Jabber room. Yeah. All right, try it again. You drop off as quickly as you get recognized.
Probably type that into the Jabber room, Brian. So
Yeah.
Need echo people notice that.
Just flash up. Please tell Paul to restart his browser.
Yeah, right. Yeah, restart your browser. We are trying to get Paul connected here. You just wanted to check that you could? Okay. You haven't said anything. It'd be nice to hear you. Well, I'm going to give it 1 minute and then I'm going to get going. I can do the minutes trivia. I really did think I was going to have more people. Sorry. We've got a lot of people on remote, which is good. So this is the RUM meeting. Note well, blue sheets.
Apologies, I couldn't find the room.
No, that's all right. We're have lots of room and we haven't got to go. Look at the remote list. It's like is
there a pen to go with this?
Oh yeah. Wow.
It's,
they didn't make it. They're here.
We're basically having a virtual meeting.
Yeah.
It is scrolled off. I can't see everyone.
Yeah.
It's like a plenary.
Yeah. Yep. So that's fine.
Apparently some of this.
Yeah. Yeah. All right. So this is RUM. Well, there's the agenda. We're really just talking about the one draft and where we are and the open issues. Does anyone want to bash the agenda? Anything you want to change? If you're participating remotely, by all means, ask to speak and we'll recognize you, on including bashing the agenda. You're certainly welcome to do that if you have any suggestions.
I'm in the Jabber room.
Yes, we have someone in the Jabber room. If you just want to have someone come up to the mic, you can type it into the Jabber, and we have someone who will do that. It's because you're so quiet and reserved. Yes. All right. So if there's no agenda bashing to do, I'm going to switch to, let's see. I got to get back to Data Tracker. There's this, and the slides. I'm going to go back into this. All right, so yeah, a lot of work. Yeah, kind of.
If you press,
Yeah.
I think you do left and right rather than up or down. It goes
Yeah. All right. So the first thing I want to talk about is the discussions we've been having on the list having to do with media. The current state of the document is that G711 and Opus are mandatory to implement. There has been the discussion of what does it mean if you're gatewaying from the PSTN, and I think that we've agreed that you don't have to offer Opus if you're gatewaying from the PSTN. That's a silly thing to do. There's no requirement to be silly. We'll make sure that the text is clear on that subject. I did try to do that on the current version. Is there anything that people think that they want to see in the audio section that is not there? Or if we solve this one issue having to do with, yes, you have to implement it, but you don't have to use it in every call. Is there anything else that people want to have modified in the audio? And again, if you want to speak on Meet Echo, go ahead, or put something in the Jabber room any way that you want to feedback. If you're operating remotely, that would be just fine. Is there anything that people have on audio that we have not covered? I'm hearing nothing, and I'm not too surprised. Richard Shields. Richard, go ahead.
Okay. Can you hear me okay?
Yeah, it's not terrific, but it's understandable. Go ahead.
Okay. So I did post something on the email list about supporting devices that are older than maybe the Opus would be able to run on, given that we're already pushing the limits on some of these devices. And I don't remember who. Someone posted back saying that that we don't plan on, I guess, using these ancient devices. Here's my concern. My concern is as a VRS provider, the FCC will give us direction based on input from RFCs and so forth. If they simply say we must comply with this RFC without any caveats about our older devices that we do not support anymore, I mean, we don't push new firmware to them, that's a concern. So I think from a provider's perspective, this really should be a should, if there's any way to word it in that way, because a should, with my understanding, is that it's essentially a must unless there's a good technical reason why we can't implement it. And there might be cases like that for some of our older devices.
This is Brian. There are a couple of things that we need to say. One of which is that there isn't any way to control. The IETF has no control over what the FCC does. But we have to do things that we think are the technically best solution that we have in a new document. If you're trying to make the assumption that you can upgrade a very old device to new firmware or software and meet the RU spec, I'm not sure that I think that that's reasonable or possible in most cases. But so I understand the issue. I personally, just speaking as an individual at this point, would think that you really do want to implement Opus and mandatory to implement so that you can achieve high bandwidth connections in everything other than a PSTN circumstance. In my experience with implementing Opus, which I haven't done the nuts and bolts, but I've had many people implement it in devices that I've been associated with, and generally they report that it's got very low overhead. I mean, it's really easy, very, very small code space, very low compute requirements, and I doubt that that's really going to be the reason you can't run RU on an older device.
Adam Roach is an individual. Richard, do you have some notion of what the CPUs are in the devices you're talking about?
Boy, that's a really good question. I don't. I know we have some like older mobile devices that customers use, those might be the ones that are of concern.
Okay, if you have some way of finding out what those run on and like sending that to the mailing list, I work with some of the folks that did the Opus development work, and I'm happy to poke them to find out what they think is feasible on those.
Okay, thank you, Adam.
John Lennox, I'm just sort of questioning, if you're not pushing firmware updates to these things, how is it going to run RU at all?
Right, you can't. You have to do a firmware.
I mean, old systems that aren't updated by definition. So.
Yeah, I think I understand your point. But if the FCC simply says we must comply with this RFC, going by the letter of the law, then we would have to update anything that does not meet that specification.
Yeah. And so just for my own, following the list, I think generally like an ARM M3, which is sort of the very like embedded ARM chips, are able to run Opus with only a little bit of tuning, as I understand it. So
yeah, are they running video as well?
If you're running video, so if you have to run video, either you have dedicated video hardware. But no, my point is, if you're running video, either you have dedicated video hardware, in which case it doesn't matter, or the Opus is trivial compared to the video.
Yeah. Okay.
Yeah, I mean,
thank you.
We're this is Brian, and I do think that the load that Opus places on a CPU is very small compared to what video does, and unless you're running at 99% CPU utilization and the 1% will take you over, and I can imagine that you could be in a circumstance like that, but it's, I hope you aren't. Yeah. But I think the real problem is that getting a document through the IETF requires that we do, put our best current practice, and Opus is clearly our best current practice. And we can make accommodations for backwards compatibility. That's always a possible thing to do. But in terms of meeting the requirements of a device, meeting the requirements of a new specification, it would be very hard to get it through a document through without requiring what we think is best current practice.
All right, thank you, appreciate it.
Is there anything else about anything else about audio that people want to bring up? We'll work with anybody who wants to make sure that the text on gatewaying the PSTN is clear enough. If there's anybody that wants to make suggestions on wording on that, please send them to the list, and I'm happy to work on that, because I do want that to be very clear. Paul? There you go. No audio. See your video? Don't hear your audio.
No.
Nope. No audio at all. Silence. Yeah. Paul, I'm going to let James Hamlin have the floor, and you can work on your audio and try bringing me back. James, you're...
Hello? Can
Yeah.
I be heard?
Yes.
Hi. Just to come back to what Richard was saying, I think our problem is that there are two sides to the RUM interface. There's the RUE itself and there's the provider side. And the way the document's phrased, I think the provider side represents essentially the interface to the PSTN and a whole load of legacy things which are not RUEs, some of which, as we said, may not be possible to upgrade. And so it's not just the PSTN that is the only place where you have legacy, and that's what I think needs to be made clear in the wording.
Okay.
Sense?
Yeah. Yes. I'm going to. This is Brian. I'm going to read back to you what I heard out of that, and I certainly, if I'm interpreting it correctly, I agree with you. You're saying that in addition to gatewaying a call from the PSTN, you may be connecting to a device which is not RUE compliant, and you want to be able to establish a communication with them on audio path, and the only thing offered by that legacy device is G711, and you want to make sure that the RUE spec clearly allows talking to a device that doesn't support RUM, doesn't support Opus. And I think everybody agrees with you that if you're calling a device which is not RUE compatible but is otherwise able to create a video session and an audio session using G711, that should be fully supported by a device conforming to the document. And if the wording is not clear on that point, I'm very happy to work with you to make sure that it is very clear on that point.
Right, Adam Roach again as an individual. So it sounds like basically want to say instead of PSTN, just legacy
any
devices,
device, like
right?
any legacy device,
or non-RUE devices, effectively.
Okay.
Yeah.
Yes, certainly. I think that's very appropriate. We should do that.
Okay, thanks.
Yeah. All right, I'm going to try Paul again. Paul? Nope, dropped off. Yep. All right. If there's nothing else on audio, I'm going to go to video. And a reminder that we did agree that H.264 is the only mandatory to implement codec. And the question I have for the room is there anything other than what WebRTC says about H.264 that we need in the document? If you go read the specs, there are a number of things that it says that you have to implement in order to maintain streams and restarts and all that framing, all that kind of stuff. But is there anything else that we need to say in addition to what's in the WebRTC that will get us what we want? And again, I'm thinking mostly about the backwards compatibility part. If there are pieces that we want to require in addition to what WebRTC requires in order to get better backwards compatibility, I'm happy to put that kind of thing in. So if anyone has any suggestions on what might need to be added to the current text beyond what the WebRTC specs say about video, again, I'm real happy to put that in. All right, no one apparently has anything to say. Again, if you think of something, oh, okay, Isaac. Go ahead, Isaac.
Hi, can you hear me okay?
Yes, you're fine.
Awesome, great, thank you. One issue we do have with providers, and I'm not sure what WebRTC says about this, but we do require mode 1 because there are a lot of devices that can't encode there are some older devices and codecs that weren't able to do mode 1. And so they would end up sending really large packets that ended up getting fragmented. So we did require endpoint support mode 1 for packetization for H.264. I don't know what WebRTC says on that, but that might be something that we need to include to ensure interoperability across many devices.
Adam?
Adam Roach. Yeah, so the WebRTC video specification indicates that packetization mode 1 must be supported and other modes may be negotiated and used. I actually didn't understand the point you're making enough to know whether that's a problem for you.
Yeah. Isaac, you're still on. Is that all right?
Yeah, if mode 1 is required, then I think we should be okay. So
Great.
we can check on that. Thank you.
Great.
Thanks.
I certainly would encourage anybody to who's listening, or and any of the providers or anybody else interested to go back and look to see what's in the WebRTC spec and think about what you think you need to have. I'm not opposed to adding some more requirements if that'll get us more backwards compatibility. We've had really good success in getting interoperability with WebRTC, but that's WebRTC to WebRTC. And I understand the limitations that, saying, oh yeah, well, WebRTC worked really great. Yeah, not good enough. So if you wouldn't mind taking a look at the details here and making sure that the things we need are there, I'd appreciate it. And again, send that to the list and I'll make sure it gets into the next version. Is there anything else on video anybody wants to talk about? All right. The next media I have is text, and following our prior discussions, the only thing that's required is RFC 4103, which is RTP transport. You'll recall we had the discussion of whether we're going to require the data channel from WebRTC and decided not to. So this makes it compatible with any other device that does real-time text with SIP. And I don't think there's anything that needs to be done there, but if there is anything that people want to bring out, I'm happy to talk about that now, but I think we're okay in the text side. Any comments on text? All right. So the next subject I want to get into somewhat relates to the discussion that we had earlier about how the document currently treats providers and RU devices. And the text does, in fact, have things like the RU must do this, providers may do that, etc. And I'd like to propose that as an IETF draft, that really doesn't have a lot of relevance to the kind of documents that we typically create. We're defining a protocol, or really we're profiling an interface. And I'd like to see if there's support for getting rid of that wording and just talk about the interface as what's required across the interface. And that speaking to our VRS provider, US VRS provider folks, that means the FCC may not get exactly what it wants out of that, because it doesn't put a requirement on you that you do anything particular. It just says across the interface, this must be supported. That would make it more like an IETF document. The current document is a little strange for a longtime IETF participant. If people like what's there, I'm all right leaving it, but I'd like to move it to just having a specification of the interface and not of which side does what. Any comments on that? I hear no one. If there isn't an objection, the next version will do that. I will at least take a crack at it. Can always back out if we don't want to go forward, but that's what I like to do. James?
Just an observation and I guess a question. Surely this kind of situation must come up quite a bit, for example, in pure client-server interfaces where there's definitely one side which is different from the other. And I think for the reasons we've said, there is a difference between the two sides in this interface in the sense that we're standardizing a new interface to what is a range of systems, some of which contain legacy elements. So there is an inherent asymmetry in what we're trying to do. Is it really that unusual to have to address that kind of situation?
Well, you most certainly have two sides of an interface, and you might have clients and servers, and the servers may have different requirements to clients. That's certainly not all that unusual. But usually, what you say is that I mean, but we don't have a circumstance like that here. We're really talking about a device interfacing towards a service. It's the service, the what in the PSTN we call the UNI interface, right? It's the user to network interface. And what happens in the network, or what happens to some other device that's connected to the network, or anything like that, is outside of the range of the specification. The specification only talks about what does it look like on the wire between the end device and the network. In this case, the provider's network, but that's what it looks like. It's only there, and that means that you don't have to. Well, that we're not saying what happens inside the provider network. We're only saying what happens on the connection between the user device and the network. Does that make sense to you? And is that helpful in getting where I'm proposing to go?
I think so. My first instinct is to think that because there is some asymmetry, that the language will be simpler if it makes the kinds of distinctions that it has. But I think if the structure of the language is changed, what we'll care about is the meaning in the end. So this will come down to which way explains things most succinctly, I think.
Yeah, and I as editor, I won't mind having a reset if we try something and we don't like it and we want to go back to where it was. I'll keep the source text around, and I can always undo text. Let's see, I've got several people in the queue, so let me move on to Paul.
Let's just see, does it work this time? Can you hear me?
Yes.
Chrome works better than Firefox today. In the VRS provider specs, I mean, we have a more complex architecture. I mean, it's not just devices talking to similar devices or something like that. We have roles for these things. So, the provider has a role separate, and the point-to-point call between two rows, is topologically different. And so I think that's the perspective from which, there's asymmetry. And so if you just make a point-to-point call, then it's root to root and it's all fine. But if the root is calling and it ends up at a provider, it may be talking to an IVR kind of device for a while, and then it may be talking to a conferencer. The conference is in the interpreter. And it's technically, at least as things currently stand, there is no requirement that the devices that interpreters that work on VRS use meet the root spec. And and maybe that'll change too. But so to me, I could see a utility in an asymmetry, but I think to deal with it, I think we would have to introduce some more terminology and stuff like that in the document that to define what the roles are. On top of that, I mean, as far as the earlier consideration, I mean, there's a lot of concerns for the providers that ultimately come down to what the FCC is going to do. And I realize that the FCC is kind of like out of scope for us, sort of. But I think we have to, yeah, the situation's different. If the FCC is going to issue a regulation that that for which the RUSPEC is one part, and there's like other parts for backward compatibility or something like that, than it is if the expectation is that the FCC is just going to say, everybody's got to support this, and it's not clear to me how we sort that out. But I think it would help the providers if they knew what was going to happen.
Yeah.
And because it makes a big difference in how we write this stuff.
Yeah.
I don't know how we go about getting a clarification there if we can.
Well, we can work on that. There are a couple other people in the queue, so I'm going to move on.
Yeah, I'm good.
Isaac? Oh, Isaac dropped out. All right, Richard. We'll get Richard.
Oh, great. So back on what James was saying about the must for RU and may for providers. One thing, of course, I'd have to go through the document with with that in mind and understand, trying to see how that will all play out. I did briefly just run through the document looking for musts and may, and one jumped out at me, and I'm wondering how you would deal with this with your current approach. And it's a paragraph in section 5. It's, in addition, the RU must and providers may conform to an illicit series of RFCs. Like, for example, one of them is ICE. And as far as I know, I think Sorensen is the only provider that uses ICE today. So how would you go about rewriting that? Would you say that the RU must and just drop the providers may?
I wouldn't. What I would say is that ICE is mandatory to implement for a RU compatible device. And if it sends ICE candidates out, it may or may not get responses depending on what it's trying to connect to.
Okay.
And so I across the interface, ICE is supported. But as with any other, I mean, you picked on ICE, which is something we know a fair amount about. And, if the other end doesn't know anything about ICE, then you're not going to get any candidates back. And if it does, you will. So RU to RU is going to work, and RU to back to old device may not. And, something in the middle can screw stuff up, and the devices have to cope with that. But that's the way ICE is built anyways. So I think you're probably okay, but I think your intuition of, let's go look at the cases where they're asymmetric and decide whether there's a problem is probably the right one, and we'll do that. And I found another one which is in 5.3, and that one is RU must and providers should support info requests. Well, again, the same thing. Across the interface, you should allow the info request. And whether it comes up, that is, whether it's ever sent, is an issue. But if you get it, you should handle it. I think that's that's where that's more of the example that I had, where I don't think that we should have an asymmetry in the sense of across the interface, an info should be supported.
Okay, so in that example I gave, it would
Yeah.
simply just be reworded as, in addition, the room must, and not mention providers at all.
Correct.
Okay.
That's exactly correct.
All right. Thank you.
Anyone else? So what I'm getting out of this is that there's some concern that might be problematic, but there's no there isn't really an objection as long as the reality comes out all right. And as the editor, I'm making a proposal that I'm willing to back out if it doesn't work out. So it'll be on me to back it out if it doesn't work. But I'm going to do that. I'm going to put out a version that doesn't use the word provider on the interface side. I mean, I got rid of all cases of provider because it is what's on the other side. But I'm gonna try and get rid of this asymmetry thing.
John, I mean, I kind of feel like if this isn't actually making normative changes to what actually is done, that's editorial prerogative.
Yeah. Okay. Yeah, it doesn't. All right. Anything else on that subject? All right. When we started the work, and I brought in the original draft, which was based on the work that MITRE had done on the FCC's behest, there were a couple of things that were flagged as maybe they would survive in the IETF draft and maybe they wouldn't. And I'd like to start the discussion of what survives and what doesn't. The two things that I know about that are worth talking about are the provisioning mechanism and the context mechanisms. Provisioning, currently in the draft, there is a provisioning mechanism which works by discovering and downloading a JSON object that provisions the device. There's a known issue with that having to do with usernames and passwords, which we would have to come up with an alternative for. The question I have for the room and the people on the call is do we want to keep it? I personally would like to keep it. I think it's useful. I think it's very helpful to be able to provision a device with a file instead of having to do it manually. And I think the mechanism that's there, which is download a JSON file, is a pretty reasonable mechanism. There was discussions of using other mechanisms that the IETF has defined, but I think this is probably what people would prefer to see. Other than how we handle username and password, are we keeping it? Is it all right to keep it? Or is it something that we think we'll have enough trouble coming to agreement on? I'd like to leave it. So this is we had discussed whether this happens. I'm asking the question now. I personally would like to keep it as it is, pretty much, fixing the username and password. We can deal with the details, right? If there's some aspects of the file or the provisioning, the things that it does, happy to deal with any of the details. It's just that I'm asking the top level question of, does the mechanism itself stay in the document? Any comments on that? The default is leave it. It's already there, and I think it's fine. Do people have a preference for how to handle the username and password? I will propose some mechanism. I'll figure out what I'm going to propose, but it'll be something that most modern substrates can handle reasonably, right? It'll be encoded in some way, right, as a file of some kind, and it'll be something that's standardized. I mean, I'm just going to use an existing standard, I'm not going to make anything up. Isaac?
Yeah, I'm not sure exactly what you're referring to. Can you be specific about what section that's in?
Yes, sure.
In the profile?
Yeah.
Thank you.
So what I'm talking about is Section 9, provisioning and provider selection. And if you go through that, you'll see there are really two, one for the provider selection and the other for the provisioning piece. There are two JSON objects defined that provide all of the data for choosing among multiple providers and provisioning for a given provider. But that's the part I'm talking about, Section 9. Go ahead, Isaac.
So on that, it does say, so a configurable URL. So that implies that there's some type of service and therefore a provider that would then be providing this JSON with all of the provider's information in it? Or is this a provider by provider URL?
It is provider by provider. And it's you provision each of the provider's URIs, and you retrieve from that provider the JSON object.
Okay, so there must be some global thing then that says, here's all the provider URLs that you can go to get the configuration, password, etc. for that provider.
The current document doesn't describe how that works. It just says you provision it with one or more URIs. I'm happy to change that, by the way. I'm not in love with that mechanism. That's just what's there now.
Yeah, I'm just trying to understand where that's coming from. So you're thinking that could just be something that's part of the RU, and if a URL needs to get added, there would need to be a new version of it that would have that in it. Like say, for example, a new provider comes online or a provider goes offline. How does that get handled? And then the other kind of follow-up question to that is I'm not even sure how that works for the hearing call side, right? So let's say I'm a Sorensen user, I use the RU, but then I say, oh, I want to use purple right now. And so I get the purple configuration URL. It gives me everything I need to register with purple or Z. How then does my hearing call get routed? Like that's still going to come to the provider that owns the number. So it's hard to even understand how that works outside of just a test case. Kind of like what MITRE is doing now with BATRP, just using it to test interoperability.
So the way it's currently described, it's not clear, and I think that's a fault of the document, and we'll have to fix it. Whether a device is allowed to or required to support more than one registration at a given time. But ignoring that little detail where it doesn't say, the way it's described, you have entirely separate accounts with entirely separate telephone numbers.
So the idea is that I would be switching phone numbers at the same time.
If you
have my
another selection.
ZVRS purple number, and then I have my Sorensen number.
Yes.
And as I switch back and forth, so you're really not trying to do like a one-stage dial around,
no,
or anything like that.
That's not what this describes. This describes the ability to have more than one account, each of which has its own telephone number. What it doesn't say is whether you can have more than one active or not, and that might just be an implementation question.
Yeah, so I can reread the document, but it might be good. I think it would be good to clarify that.
No problem. And please send, I agree. We want to clarify that part. So if you wouldn't mind reading it and send some text suggestions, I'd appreciate it, but I'll take a look at it and try and improve it, because I agree that it's not very clear. It just sort of launches into the mechanism without a discussion of how it's supposed to be used.
Okay, thank you.
Paul?
Hi. I'm just trying to dredge up memories from like 3 years ago of what the original thinking on this stuff was. And my recollection is that, yes, there was imagined some sort of service that made this advertisement of what all the different providers were that you might choose among, that you had to fetch in order to go through that step and pick which provider you wanted to provision with. And I think the other thing we're dancing around here is dial around, in the sense of there was the distinction between, at least in principle, the RU, a sufficiently capable RU implementation might allow you to have registrations with multiple providers, each with its own phone number. But in addition, it would have a mechanism to do what's called one-stage dial-around, which would allow you to just click a button to say which provider you wanted to place a particular call through when you're placing outgoing calls, and then your call would be outbound, which I think would address part of what was previously being asked about.
Yeah. Yes.
The third part.
So, Paul, just interrupting you a little bit. Section 522, independent of the Section 9 that we were talking about, discusses one-stage dial-around. So the document does what you recollected it was going to do.
Yeah. The other thing I think is if we're trying to have this deal with hearing users that have video support, then I think there would have to be a mechanism for them to get their RU-like device configured. So either the existing providers would somehow have to be able to support hearing users with RU devices, which isn't currently within their mandate, or else there would have to be some other pseudo provider that provided that service, like MITRE sort of does. But I think, between those things, I think you cover all the possibilities. But like I say, the original imagined mechanism was that when you turned on a brand new RU or something like that, it would know where to go to fetch this list of providers, and then it would go fetch that, and then basically provide you some sort of configuration mechanism that pick the one you want, and then it would go through the provisioning mechanism with that one,
Mm-hmm.
and then you'd be set.
Okay. The text does seem to follow what you just said, so we'll work on it. I got Isaac behind you, and he may have more information.
And I
Sorry, I cut you off, and I didn't mean to. Isaac, you have the floor.
Yeah, I just wanted to clarify that it has nothing to do with a hearing user using video or a RU client or anything like that. It's just when a hearing person places a call to a deaf number, that call gets routed to the provider that owns that number.
Yeah.
There's no way, I just don't see a reasonable way that you would have a hearing call going to one provider and then somehow routed to another provider. So this idea of one-stage dial-around where the user just picks which provider they want to use, there might be some ways to make that work for an outbound call, but it's not bidirectional and doesn't really seem feasible given that. So I just wanted to add that clarification for Paul. Thank you.
Yeah, I agree with you, Isaac. That's what I think. All right. What I'm hearing is leave it as it is. but make the text clearer about how this mechanism is supposed to work. Which I will do. And if anybody has text suggestions, send them to the list, and I'll try and incorporate them in the next version. But I'm hearing leave the mechanism, do a better job of explaining how it works. Any other discussion on that? Okay, the next one is contacts. So the current document has two mechanisms for contacts. There's an upload and download of a file of JCards. And then there's real-time sync using CalDAV. Not CalDAV. I wrote the wrong thing. CardDAV. Sorry, that's CardDAV, not CalDAV. It's not calendars. It's contacts. The floor is open for people's opinions of what to do. Currently the upload download mechanism is supported by most providers, and CardDAV isn't. What shall we do with this? Isaac.
Yeah, I just wanted to mention that, really the issue with CardDAV is that it's fairly limited in compared to what, some of the things we do with our current contacts, especially for deaf users, where we implement things like visual caller ID, whether that's color or patterns. There are a lot of things we do. Sharing contacts across users and groups. I mean, the CardDAV is just pretty limited in comparison. Like it might be okay for somebody to go, or some third party, whether it's MITRE or somebody else. There's no reason they couldn't host their own CardDAV server, and then RU or BATRP could use that. It's just hard to see how it makes sense to indicate that would be something that the providers, and this goes back to your must versus may language, right? You've said, well, you just want this to describe the interface, but if it says the interface is CardDAV, and then later the FCC comes along and says, well, providers must be compliant with the RUM profile or whatever it's called now, then it effectively becomes a must and requires us to do something that's just doesn't provide a good user experience.
Are these limitations of CardDAV per se, or of JCard/VCard?
I mean, my understanding of CardDAV is that it's just a VCard server, so I'm assuming the same limitations apply.
Okay, I mean,
like there's no standard defined, there's no standard for visual color ID or patterns, colors, etc.
I mean, presumably these could be extensions to VCard/JCard, right?
Yeah, I think your point, Jonathan, is that it's not the mechanism, but the data that the mechanism is transporting.
Yeah, well, I mean, unless you mentioned like the ability to share. Yeah,
but even then, the mechanism allows you to do that. It's just how does the server, what cards does the server send you? And as you say, the JCard format, as with the XCard format, as with the original VCard format, is extensible. So adding extensions for things like a visual representation of the user in some way is certainly straightforward. And I mean, the counter argument for saying, well, providers some providers do some things, it's yes, but that makes the device proprietary unless it's using some kind multiple ends can implement. Paul is waiting in queue. Let me move to him. Paul, go ahead.
Hi. I just wanted to get more clarification on the question, I guess. my understanding is right, which might be wrong, right, is that right now the devices the providers use, the contact list functionality is hosted on the servers, on the provider's servers, and the device has some sort of interface to it. I'm not clear on how you're imagining that working with the RU spec. Would it mean that, would it fit within the functionality of the RU, or would the thing that's a RU also have to have extra functionality in order to interface with your contact list, especially since you don't have a call when you're trying to use the contact list to establish a call, and if it requires some extra functionality, then that like blows the whole idea of the a portable RU that works across multiple providers, unless that mechanism is standardized.
The way it works now, as you implied, the whole contact list is internal to the provider, and so the way you move contacts from one provider to another is you request your old provider to send you a file of your contacts, and then you send that file to your new provider and he uploads it into his service. So what the RU spec makes that a little bit better, right? It says that you can do the upload and download with the RU. You don't have to have it go from you to your provider to, and then he sends you an email with a file, and then you email that list to your new provider. It at least gets rid of that part, but doesn't do much more than that, right? It's just slightly better than where we are now. There are some equivalents, as Adam said. There's some equivalents that some providers have for handling contacts among the multiple devices supported by the same provider. So if you have a mobile device and you have a fixed device, some providers do have services that allow you to sync your contacts between those. That's done again within the service, and the card DAV thing would give you, as Adam said, a subset of what some providers do.
You're referring to Isaac, not Adam,
Isaac,
by the way.
yes, yeah. Isaac.
I agree with what you said pretty much, but I think there's a little unclarity still of whether we're really talking about the contact list, or if we're talking about as a piece of data, or if we're talking about the contact list feature that the end user uses to search his contacts and pick somebody and use one of them to make a call. And it makes a difference, because I think implicit in this, although it doesn't say it anywhere because we don't talk about the user interface, is that with the RU spec, is that this contact list mechanism is just a way to get the list of contacts into the RU, with the expectation that the RU somehow or other, provides its own user interface to that contact list for the user to use for making calls. And that mechanism then, the boundary between the proprietary part and the non-proprietary part is this transfer mechanism, whether it's card DAV, or whether it's upload download of a list of contacts, but that's different from a mechanism that assumes that there's maybe a contact list application on the device that talks to some server mechanism on the provider that provides like a web interface or something to the provider that offers the contact list mechanism to the user. In principle here, I think normally an end user nowadays, I mean, of course, they only transfer a contact list if they decide to use a different provider. So it's something you do, like once a year or something. And so at least when we discussed it before, the mechanism that you use to transfer, yes, you could request a transfer of the list, but it wasn't real time. It might take weeks to get, or hours or something to get it, and it was kind of like a manual process at the provider, and or at least maybe not to upload, but to download, whichever way is which. Here, I mean, certainly it's imagined it's a real-time function, and that, in principle, it's just an optimization. That if every time you turned your route on and it connected to the provider, it might just load the contact list from the provider and then use it. And you can use CardDAV to sync it, in which case it probably is more efficient, or it can just transfer the whole thing, which might, depending on how big your list is, might take longer or might not. But at the end of the day, once it was into your device, all the mechanism for using it in your device would be local to the device. It wouldn't depend on an interface to the provider.
Oh, okay.
And,
we got other people in the queue, Paul. You've had the floor
I'm
for a
done.
while. Okay. Adam, I think you were next.
Thanks. So I think Paul actually has a good point, but I believe we can get away. Sorry, Adam Roach, speaking as an individual. I think we can probably get away with just defining the interface here without having to get into how the device uses it. I think like all the modes of operation
Correct.
Paul mentioned would be perfectly valid.
Yes.
But what I got up here was actually I wanted to probe a little bit at what Isaac was saying around the capabilities of vCard and JCard, given that they're extensible formats. And the two examples that I heard him give at least were visual caller ID, which I presume is a picture-based approach where you like have contact pictures, and then colors, which I presume is categories. And both of those are actually supported by the current vCard format. So I'd be curious if we could collect what the current capabilities are used by these systems and see whether there exists a good mapping. And it might even be worth kind of doing that analysis in the document, pointing out where things might not be obvious.
Yeah.
But I would be really surprised if the capabilities, given that it's extensible, and I'm looking at the IN registry right now, and it's like more than a full page on my browser of fields that you can put in these things. Yeah. I would be really surprised if they weren't covered in some way or another.
Yeah. Isaac.
Yeah, I just wanted a couple of things. I want to call out, when I think of like my iPhone and my Android phone, that's pretty much what I have to do, right? I have to export my contacts from one phone and use some service or some other utility to import on my other phone. I don't really expect like iCloud. I don't expect Apple's iCloud to work with my Google phone or my Google contacts to work with my iPhone. So that seems pretty equivalent and standard in the industry to have to export to a file and import on another device. On the caller ID, the visual caller ID is more than a picture, which is pretty typical and standard. For us, it's actually a pattern of lights, and it's something that we do. I don't think that other providers do it exactly the same, and I think we do actually have a patent on that. So the problem is that there aren't really any standards defined across providers for how some of those things are done. So you kind of end up with kind of a lowest common denominator of functionality across contacts, which just doesn't seem ideal. And then I think I agree with what Paul was saying, where it seems odd to say that the provider has to then provide this type of CardDAV service, where it's really, I think that's up to whoever the RU provider is, if they want to do their own CardDAV service as a way to manage contacts across devices devices, that's great, but it doesn't necessarily make sense to say for the provider that the providers would need to do that. Thanks.
So I've been listening to all of this, and I think there are a couple things that occur to me, and one is to reinforce the notion of the difference between the transport and the data format. We're talking about a J card, which is extensible and already has a large list of attributes. And then we're talking about the transport mechanism for that, which is a file of JCards or a sync of JCards. And it does seem to me that even if you had a set of features, that is, you had a set of user characteristics that were associated with a contact that was proprietary, you could just use the extension mechanisms to carry that, and you may not, that data may not go to another provider, but they don't have any way of dealing with it anyways because it's a proprietary mechanism, which is fine as long as you implement the standard stuff. It's a question of whether or not it's a good idea for the device to have the ability to manage contacts within itself and have the ability to obtain contacts from some service, not specified who runs the service. It just says the device that across the interface, a file transfer of JCards and the CardDAV interface is supported. And it seems to me that both of those are good things to do. It doesn't prohibit you from extending it. It doesn't prohibit you from saying, I don't supply the service. All I do is support the interface across it. So the URI that you provision, which is your CardDAV server, doesn't point to you, points to something else. That's all fine. But I think that I personally think that it's a good thing for the RU to have to support both the upload download and the sync mechanisms. And one more thing, and then I'll let Adam talk. I actually don't upload and download contacts anymore. I haven't had to do that in a very long time. Sync across services works quite well across almost every service that I use because they all use the same standards now. So that's just my experience.
Adam Roach, you actually covered almost everything that I got up here to say, but I want to go ahead and put a fine point on 3 specific items. The first is that the JCard and VCard format specifically has ways to register vendor-specific extensions for things like proprietary features. The second is the sync to external, like my phone right now, my address book is predominantly stored on Yahoo because they have an address book server that I can use CardDAV with. And that syncs to my other non-Apple devices with no problems, which is a really good real-life example of exactly what you're talking about.
Yeah.
The third thing was related to the third thing that you said, and I can't remember what it was, but I pretty much agree with everything that you just said.
Okay.
Jonathan, the one other thing I'd add is if there are specific contact things that are, civilly useful for deaf and hard of hearing users that should be standardized, then we should standardize them. I mean, not in scope of this working group, but take them to whatever group does CardDAV and say, here are some things that are specifically for deaf and hard of hearing users. Let's standardize them.
Yeah, if they're not, if there is covered by patents or something, but sure.
Or even if there are patents, do an IPR declaration on them.
Yeah,
whatever.
Sure. Yeah. If the text is clarified to make sure that it's not an implied that the URI that's the CardDAV server or the file upload download is not specified as who operates it, is there an objection to leaving the mechanisms as they currently are defined? Again, I'm happy to work on wording to make sure that it's clear that it's not implying that any particular operator is running any particular service. It's just that the interface itself supports both a file transfer and it's web retrieval, right? It's download of a JSON, a large JSON object. It's not really a file. I see Paul and Isaac. Isaac.
I was just going to say that seems like it could work. We would just need to see that text.
Yeah.
See what that looks like before we consider that. So thank you.
Great. Well, we'll definitely do that. Paul.
I just want to comment on this, that at least the way I use the stuff, I mean, on my phone, I can sync to multiple places. And I mean, I can see here, this configuration is a way to provide a place to sync to that's linked to the provider somehow, whether they implement it or do it by referral. But like Adam suggested, it may be that the user wants to have his own. And so I'm not sure how it fits into the thing, but I think there ought to be a mechanism for the user to provide a place to sync to, independent of what the provider provides.
I think that's an excellent idea, and we definitely should do that. Currently, it is part of the provisioning, but I think that ought to be separately provisionable, because if you like your contacts coming from Google instead of your provider, then you should be fully entitled to do exactly that. So that's definitely a thing to do for sure. Anything else on the subject of context? Okay, so now is the big question of what else is there? If we're not ready to call for last call on the document. I mean, we're not talking about that, but I would like to know what other areas of the document people think need work. Where are there things that you don't currently believe it is in the state that it needs to be in? And I know I've kind of sprung this question, so I'm not really asking. I mean, if people know things, by all means, come to the mic and let's have them now. But this is more of a plea to go back through the document and bring up areas that you think need to be discussed that you don't think are ready to go. That can be small stuff or big stuff, but I am. We started out with a pretty good draft. We brought a whole bunch of issues up, and we're working on those issues. I'd like to know what other issues people think that exist in the document, so that we can start thinking through what we want to say. So that's, as I say, it's more of a plea to read the document and send comments to the list of what areas you think need more work than coming to the mic today and telling me what's bad.
Hi, Alvis John. I apologize for being late and possibly missed the discussion. I read the draft this morning, and I found a number of occurrences of the term "with the understanding that," and then protocol violation. I would like to have the behavior that was intended spelled out rather than having the understanding that.
Okay.
For instance, there was mention that we don't use media stream tracks, but it doesn't say what you mean by that. So that if you instead put in, but we are not going to send MSIDs and we are going to ignore them on reception, that's fine. I mean, if you want to break the standard, say exactly how you should behave when you break the standard.
Okay, I'll take that under advisement and go look at all those instances and try and come up with good wording. I may contact you for suggestions, but thank you. That with the understanding that is usually not good standards language, and I wrote that, so I should, I shouldn't have said that.
The one thing that comes, are you done with that topic?
Yes.
The one thing that comes to my mind was still this question that we had a discussion for a while, and then we dropped it a couple of times, I think. This thing about having client certificates in order to verify that the device has been certified by somebody. That's still hanging, isn't it?
There is no text currently. There is provisioning of a certificate for the purposes of doing mutual auth, which we could drop if people don't want it. But that there isn't anything. The piece that's still there is the call info header that tries to tell you where this thing came from.
No, that's not what I'm talking about.
Yeah, I didn't think that's what you were talking about. You were talking about some
No,
kind of
it's
crypto
the
signature
mutual.
over the code.
It's the client authentication. There was I know you had it in there, and it was unclear to people what it was about.
I thought I cleared that up.
Well, we had some discussion on the list, and I relayed what I remembered it had originally been put in for, which I got confirmation from some other people was true, but which didn't come through in the spec, and it was intended as a mechanism by which manufacturers of devices could get them certified, and then they would get a cert that they used to prove that their device had been certified, that the providers could use to screen out uncertified devices from their, disallow them from being connected. And frankly, I never believed that mechanism as written worked. And yet, the providers have a desire for something like that. I don't know a mechanism that would work. I mean, obviously, we have things, like phones, that have certificates, like Google Store and stuff like that certify apps that you can load into your device, but the mechanisms for those don't work in this circumstance. And so I was kind of always, personally, I never understood why we had to have it, but the providers wanted it as a safety mechanism for their network to keep out untested stuff. And so if we're going to try to do that, the mechanism that's there, I don't think it works for that purpose. Okay. And we would need to see if we could find a different mechanism that did.
Mm-hmm. All right. Got two more people in the queue. Let's see what Isaac and Steve have to say. Isaac, you're on.
Yeah, I agree with Paul. And I think this is definitely a big concern and something that we definitely do need. We need the ability to protect our systems from hackers or anyone that might get their hands on this open source code for the RU or VATRP. And I can see ways that it could work where it's like, if I, the provider, and the one building the RU, I can include my client cert, which I only have the private key for it. And so that I'm the only one that's able to do that, so that when that client connects to my system, I know that it has been tested and won't cause any issues on my system that could affect my user's ability to communicate. So it's absolutely critical that we have some mechanism so that we aren't just creating this open door for anyone to connect into our system, which is not typical. I think the example that's been used is web browsers, right? And web browsers are another place that you might use a client cert. So my bank could do that. My bank could say, hey, look, here's a client certificate. Install this on your browser, and this will ensure that you're the only one that can access your account. It frankly hasn't been used because it's difficult, right? From a user perspective, to have to get a certificate and understand how to install that. And so I think the example that was given was that, well, web browsers are open source. Anyone can go get that code, and they can go and connect to any web server. And this is just the same as that. But it's not the same because it's our communication system. We're the phone company for the deaf, and we really have to protect our system and our users from any hacker or nefarious actors that might want to do them harm. So it's absolutely critical that we have something. I hadn't noticed that it had been removed from the latest version. We need to get that back in, and we need to figure out a way that we can make that work. Thank you.
Right now, all it says is during the establishment of a secure connection with the provider, the room may be asked by the server for a client certificate. In this case, it should provide the provisioned client certificate. See section 9.2. Providers may reject requests that fail to provide a recognized certificate. That's what it currently says. It is there, but it doesn't have. It's provisioned into the device, and it's a certificate, okay. Right? It's in order for that, we'd have to be talking about exactly who's owning what part of what thing. That text is not very clear about how that works, but
yeah, you're right. So it is there. I see that now, and I think that the example that Paul gave previously was almost something like an app store, right? Like as an iPhone developer, I submit my app to Apple, they test it, they verify it works okay, and then they make it available in their app store for any user to download and use on their phone. There was really no other way for me to distribute an app to iPhone users without going through the Apple App Store where they provide that authentication. Now I don't know how that would work in our scenario with the RU, but there needs to be something like that where the providers can test and verify that the client won't cause any harm to their system.
I'm going to move on to Steve, and then we have Jonathan at the mic, and I'll probably have some stuff to say, but let me go on to Steve.
Hi. Thank you. I was going to change subject, so I was going to say if there's any other comments with regard to this, maybe we should continue with that before I change subjects.
Okay, let's finish this up, and then we'll come back to you.
Okay.
All right. So Jonathan Lennox, just on the certificate thing, I mean, the reason why Apple is able to sign things from the App Store is they sign the entire app, whereas this, you're not uploading your entire RU software to the provider. So the provider has no guarantee that the RU software hasn't been modified, or indeed that somebody hasn't just extracted a certificate from one, piece of RU software and using it in their own, to attack. And honestly, I feel like saying that, you can't have, the implication that you can't have a, open source implementation of a RU endpoint running on a PC, that is allowed to connect to the system, and that, deaf and hard of hearing users can't, do their own development of their own endpoint and make their own enhancements, feels like it's kind of locking down the system more than I would like. Mm-hmm. And I think, in general, if you're running a service on the internet, you have to have some way of protecting from, from something, attacking your internet. And I think the protection here is, what you actually have is you don't know the endpoint software, you know the person. And if you have a username and password that's attacking you, well, you can say, we're shutting down this person because they're not behaving legitimately. They're screwing with our system. So lock them out until we figure out what's going on.
Yeah, that's kind of my thinking, that I don't know a way to protect a piece of downloadable software from modification by any number of tools, or extracting the certificate out of that code and using that as a way to protect the other end from malignant software. You basically can't do that. We don't know how to do that. And that there just isn't, that mechanism just doesn't work.
Adam Roach, I wanted to actually put a finer point on it. It's not just that we don't know how to do that, it's we don't need to do that. Because we have a really good proof of existence of a system that handles this just fine. Mobile phones, right? I can take my SIM out of my phone and put it in any other phone without any validation of what the implementation of that phone has done. You can get like cheap, weird phones from all over the world that do heaven knows what. And as long as I'm able to authenticate, it goes into the system. And it's the same sort of setup, right? If I put my SIM into a phone that starts attacking the network, they're going to turn off my access, and the system is pretty well protected. This doesn't generally happen, but in theory it could. And I think that engineering anything more advanced than that is probably unnecessary.
Okay. Paul? Oh, you dropped. Isaac, you're up.
Yeah, well, like a SIM card would be great, right? A SIM card provides a physical hardware ID that allows me to verify that that is my user. So I don't think that's a good equivalent. The type of attack we'd be worried about would be like a brute force attack. So let's say I know my ex-girlfriend's phone number, and now I can go get the open source code, and I can fairly easily write a script that can just brute force attack the system to figure out what the password for that user is. If I'm just doing a brute force attack like that, then I don't know who that user is, and I can't necessarily just cut them off. And then, but again, something like a SIM card would be a great solution. I just don't know what the equivalent is for a software app that doesn't involve an actual device. I know there are like eSIM cards on like Google phones, but I think those still depend on a chip or mechanism within the actual device to make that possible. Thanks.
Mayor, real quick, because I can answer that.
Yeah.
It's in terms of mobile phones, we do have soft SIMs where these are things that can be pushed out. You don't have to have physical devices that represent these, and they're basically certificates. And so, yeah, the answer for how you do this in software is certificates, right? You can't brute force a cert. It's not like you can do this sort of credential stuffing that you would if you were validating with passwords.
And that part we have, right? You can have a client cert. That's okay. Correct.
Right. It certifies the user, but it's in a way that, again, it's not subject to brute forcing or credential stuffing.
I don't object to having a client cert. That part's fine, but that is a user cert, not a device cert. Paul.
Yeah, I think maybe you hit most of it now. I don't think we're going to solve this here today. I think this needs more discussion on the list to make sure we come up with something that meets the needs of the providers. Okay. The best thing I've thought of that I could imagine could work here is that the provisioning server would somehow run a self-test or something on the device to satisfy itself that the device was acceptable before provisioning it or something like that, and then it can provide the cert. But at the end of the day, it would be it would probably be a client cert, and
well, I again, if you have a sufficiently robust way of doing a one-time authentication of a user, and you can issue him a cert based on something that you trust, that you know who you're talking to before you issue that cert, then that cert is an unforgeable identification of that user. He has to have the private key in order to be able to prove that he is what he is.
I think this is a mechanism that's different than what the providers had originally imagined when the stuff was originally written into the root spec. Right. If we can determine that because the original one was on a per application basis, if you will, and I don't know how to make that work. But if something like this can be shown to be to meet the provider's needs, then maybe we have a solution.
All right.
So I think we just have to discuss it on the list.
All right. Well, I'll start that discussion on the list. I agree that that's probably a good list discussion rather than a doing it here verbally. We'll just do that. We'll start a discussion on the list and see where it ends up. Is there anything else that people know they want to do? Yes, Steve he wanted to change the subject, so now's a good time. Steve.
Great. One question I have, I'm not sure if this has been discussed, is with regards to 911 and provisioning the user. This is all from VRS respect. How does the person indicate they're deaf? And we're able to provision their home address for use with 911 services. And are we going to be passing XY coordinates to be able to service their 911 calls faster?
Okay, so I, Brian Rosen, am about as good of an expert as you'll get on this. I've been heavily involved in all of these technologies for the last 15 years. What the document currently says is that you have to be compatible with what is colloquially called I3 origination, meaning you conform to RFC 6881. That's IP emergency calls. That's what next generation 911 is in the United States, and there's equivalents coming up in other countries. There is provision in those services to support deaf users in a manner that's much better than it is now. I can help explain what all of those things are. But what the text currently says that the RU device has to support 6881. And that means that it can supply an address, or the address can be supplied by the provider that handles the call on its way towards the 911 service. It means that you can support three-way video with the bridge at the PSAP, the 911 call center. It means that that all three media are supported all the way through, from the user all the way out to the PSAP, and if necessary, out to the responders.
So does the RU
get all of that by conforming to 6881?
Okay. Does the RU application allow for the user to enter their address so that it can be verified by our 911 services that we contract with?
Right. So you don't currently have any support, as far as I know. None of the providers currently have any support for Next Gen 911. You currently use the I2 mechanisms, which are VoIP mechanisms, to the current E911 system, which are different in every way from how Next Generation 911 works. The text is not clear and could be made clearer about whether the device can supply location and how, if it did, how it is verified. And I think that prompts me to write a note in the notes that says we should clarify that in the document. As a practical matter, although the IETF doesn't like it, the way it's being deployed, the location is supplied by the provider or the network operator, the thing that provides the calling service. It would be the VoIP provider in the case of a VoIP device, rather than the end device. The 6881 implies the end device supplies location. As a practical matter, the location is being put on by the service.
So our provider,
clarify that.
We supply XY coordinates to our provider, but they require, before they'll use those XY coordinates, that there is a physical address already assigned to that person.
Yeah.
And they'll only use the XY coordinates if that person has been, quote, quote, validated or registered with them.
Yeah, I understand what you're talking about. I know all about these mechanisms. So the standards that are referred to in the current document support either XY, actually XYZ,
Yeah.
or Civic, or both.
Okay.
And again, we could clarify in the text whether or not the device has to be able to be provisioned with its location, or whether it can supply XY. We can. There's insufficient text on that subject, and I will do that. I will fix that.
Okay, because I did do a quick look for 911, and perhaps I should have looked for emergency services. I didn't see any mention of it, so.
Yeah, it doesn't say 911. It says emergency services.
Yeah.
Emergency
My bad.
call.
Thank you.
I'm just writing the note about clarifying that in the text. Oh yeah. When I make the note, it's emergency calls. Yeah. That's the problem. It's emergency services. So why will you? We've got the URN. That's what we really use. Yes, URN service SOS. Okay, but that was a good. Steve, thank you for bringing that up. That clearly is something we need to improve, and I was kind of aware of that. We also probably could spill a few words about how the current document only describes the existing system. The next generation 911. It doesn't really talk about the existing system. The device doesn't have to do anything for the existing system, so that doesn't mean anything. But we could say that, and then it would be clear. Isaac, go ahead.
I just want to clarify on when you said the device doesn't need to do anything. What it does need to do, what we do is we provide the user a way to enter their address. That's pretty typical E911 requirement you see on Vonage and other over-the-top VoIP providers. From what I've seen there, I haven't seen anything in the RU or the VATRP so far that has provided that same ability for the user to simply enter their address and or a standard mechanism to send that up to the provider. So I think that's the key piece that's missing.
If you want that provisioned in, that would be fine. Typically, what almost every service I know about does for that is a web page. I mean, that is how Vonage does it. It's not in the phone. It's not in anything that is in any interface. It's literally a web page. So if you want something beyond that, I mean, I'm happy to put that in. It isn't a problem to do that.
Yeah, I've definitely seen it in apps like Google Voice and others. But if it is a web page, I think then it's important to say that.
Okay.
So there's at least some way for the user to get that address in.
Yeah. All right. I'll add text about that.
All right.
Adam Roach, you might want to give some thought when you do that about exactly how it's going to interact with authentication, given that users are authenticated in the system right now by certificates, and you're not going to get that on the web page side of things. Makes things a little bit more interesting. So yeah, we might actually look at leveraging the SIP signaling information to convey this information to the carrier in some way.
Okay.
I was trying to remember if there was any registry use cases we used that for, and I was about to go looking, but just keep that kind of thing in the back of your mind and see if there's anything a little more elegant that might be used here.
I mean, we can send a J card. Yeah. Right? Put in call info. We have a way to do that. So, yeah. Oh, that does bring up another one. Yes, additional data. That's a note to myself. You don't know anything about it, but I do. Okay. I'll bring that subject also up. Mike? What's that?
I was going to ask if CalDAV works with these user certificates. I guess it can, but would have to.
Okay, we'll work on it. Gunnar.
Hi.
Hi.
You mentioned that for the emergency call you will get video on multi-party view. We have a discussion going on for multi-party real-time text. Will you need that as well? I think you would. Maybe I should just draw attention to what we are starting up in AVT Core. We have a new draft or a revived old draft about multi-party real-time text, and that will be discussed tomorrow in AVT Core, and hopefully you can join there and discuss multi-party real-time text, because there is more needed in the device than just receiving single media.
Yeah, I'm taking notes about that. Yep, you're right.
Okay.
Adam Roach, I just wanted to point, went and looked it up. So RFC 6442 specifically allows the use of the geolocation header field in register requests, which would be a pretty cut and dried way to handle that.
Mm-hmm. Oh, right. It explicitly does allow that. Yeah. Ha! Yeah, okay. Well, we actually have the answer, Adam. I'll just write it down. There are security implications in that, but you have to just note it. Yeah, right. Yeah. Okay. Well, gee, this is Steve?
Yeah, just a quick question. Adam, which RFC did you say? Was it 6442?
Yeah.
I believe that's correct. Is that not coming up correctly?
Which one are you looking at?
It's the geolocation
the
header
geolocation
field. It's
header.
like,
I think he's right. I think it's 6442.
Okay, just wanted to make sure.
Yeah, it's the geolocation header for SIP.
Okay, thank you.
Yep. That's referenced in our document. So there's a reference to it in the text. You can find it. Anything else people want to talk about? Other things that need to be improved in the doc before we consider it done. This will not be the last time I will ask for that, but the earlier we surface things that we need to do, the happier I'm going to be to get them done. Anything else? Well, for the lack of people in the room, this was a very fine meeting, and I appreciate all of you who, most of you are in the U.S., staying up late, and Gunnar, what time is it for you? It must be really awful. But I appreciate your participation. It's been great having you on, participating in the meeting. And I hope we'll be generating a lot of LIFT traffic as a result of all these discussions, which is always what we want to see. And unless there's anything else, I think we're adjourned. Whatever it takes.
It's like 4:45 a.m. right now, in case you're wondering. Yeah. Well, so you were talking about the virtual meeting here?
Yeah.